Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Glad to see all of you on the little grid here. Some of you welcoming me into your homes, some of you waving. Glad to see you. I want to jump right in and get to talk about leadership at a time when the environment can no longer be ignored. I don't have to tell you the current pandemic being one of those things. But also the people who predicted the pandemic, we know that more and more of these things are going to come and we can no longer ignore it. I take it most of you are HR professionals, which I take to mean you are either leaders or developing others to lead within your teams. And I want to help you. Well, I want to give proper deference to there are people in pain and suffering and dying right now. But this is also a time of tremendous opportunity, professionally speaking. One thing that I see, for example, is the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer. Very few companies have them. And I think in the coming time, many, many more companies will have them. If you want to create such a position in your firm or become such a person yourself or lead others to become something like that, or just to have that role in your firm, if your firm is hearing things from your customers, your employees, the media, your shareholders, this is a time that this is very important. And so today I want to talk about, I'm going to give you three stories of people who walked through and learned environmental leadership skills. I should say leadership skills in the area of the environment and how they developed, and how then the next thing I'm going to say is how you can lead in an area of the environment. I'm going to teach you step by step what I do with my clients, as in these three stories and many others. So you can do it yourself. I recommend bringing me in. I have a lot of experience in this area, but that's something that's going to come next. And then I'll take questions at the end. I'll start with saying a little bit about myself. Some of you know me, so I'll be kind of quick. If you have questions at the end about my background, please ask. I have a PhD in physics, so a big science background. There's a satellite that I helped build that's off in space right now, still taking data, very proud of it. I left academia to start my first company, and here's my first story in the Wall Street Journal, and there's my name, so my mom, if she sees this, can be very proud. Things went well. This is 2001. A couple years in, we hit a recession. The investors squeezed me out. I went back to business school, looking suspiciously like I did when I got my PhD, but that's the good picture. And that's where I learned that there were classes in leadership in business school, and leadership became a big passion of mine. So I teach leadership at NYU. I've coached at Columbia. I also teach directly through Spodek Academy and online. I recommend checking my blog at joshuaspodek.com. I hope it'll be one of your famous blogs. And I have this podcast, the Leadership in the Environment podcast, in which I walk people through the process that I'm going to teach you. Some of them very important people. I'll show you pictures of them in a second. And it's filling what I see as a tremendous vacuum for leadership in the area of the environment. I'm also a best-selling author, so there's Leadership Step by Step. The leadership techniques that I talk about today are in Leadership Step by Step. I just happen to apply them today in the area of the environment, but they apply all over the place. And in the bottom right, if you can see it, is my book, Initiative. I also do leadership consulting and executive training. Here's just one of the slides from when I work with companies. This is a little bit about what we do and some of the companies we work with. And here are guests that you can listen on the podcast. The process that I'm going to describe with you today, you can hear me doing it with them. So Dominic Barton, the 3-time global managing director of McKinsey, the head of corporate social responsibility at McDonald's, at Google, at West Point, at Vogue. Hopefully you guys know Marshall Goldsmith. Dory, I hope you can see her, Anand. And Lorna Davis of Danone, Patagonia, Procter & Gamble, GE, entrepreneurs, Marines. So the stuff that I'm doing now, that I'm going to describe to you now, you can hear many more stories at my podcast, Leadership in the Environment. But I'm going to tell you three stories. The first one is going to be a client, a fossil fuel company, then in media, and then at Patagonia, the clothing company. So first, my story about my client at a fossil fuel company. It's one of the big ones. You would know it if I said it in a second. They're down in Houston. He has a PhD in geophysics and was primed to move into management. And I was hired to teach him the social and emotional skills of leadership. The way that it would normally work, I would meet with him for an hour a week, and we'd either meet on the phone or by video like this. And it would be for an hour, but before that hour began, there'd be 15 minutes of chatting. We became friends. At the end, another 15 minutes of chatting, and we'd just talk about life. Something you may not know about me, I act very much on the environment. I'm in my 5th year of not flying. I throw out my garbage. It used to be once a week. Now it's about once a year. Actually, it's less than once a year. At that time, it was about once every 6 months. And that's something I mentioned him just in passing. It wasn't something, I wasn't coaching him on environmental anything. I was coaching him on being a better leader. And one time in that time before we were on the clock, he mentioned that he had taken over 3 weeks to throw out his garbage. I thought, oh, that's interesting. Why did that come up? And he said, well, because you told me about it, and it used to be once a week for him, and now it was 3 months or 3 weeks. I forget. I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. I'm glad I rubbed off on him. Didn't think much of it until maybe 3 months later. He said, Josh, remember that stuff about not throwing garbage out at home? You know, the way you do it is you buy stuff differently and you order stuff differently and you prepare food differently. So food is one of the main things. Anyway, he said, I took what I learned there and I applied it at work. And I thought he was going to say that he generated less trash at work, but that's not what he said. He said, now I use those skills and decisions that I make affecting all of Latin America reduce waste and pollution and generate more profit. You can learn skills one-on-one at home on what appear to be little things. And when people say, what does one person out of a billion, what does that make? What difference does that make? But the skills that you learn can apply everywhere. And when you are a leader, the bigger the company, the more this is important. You're at a leverage point of a system. You can affect many, many big things. So learning on a small scale is a big deal. It can be if you make it. That's the opportunity here. Next, my client at the media company. So this is an advertising agency. And again, I was coaching someone, just straight leadership coaching. And he was the global chief communications officer, so in the global C-suite of this place. And I did a 360 feedback. So I was working with the whole global C-suite and others as well. As it turned out, this company, when advertisers come in and say, send us an RFP about what you can do for us, a lot of these companies, these advertisers, they have to get a message out about how sustainable they are. And so they would say in the RFP, please tell us what your sustainability plan is and tell us what you've done to act on it. They had initiated a program or tried to, what he described as a small thing, what he described as something they should have done anyway. So what they did was they got waste baskets, and they got wire mesh ones, specifically designed so that these were not for garbage. These were only for paper, so they could recycle the paper. Nobody told the maintenance staff. And the maintenance staff put plastic garbage bags in those baskets, and people started throwing out everything, banana peels, whatever. And so they couldn't start their envisioned composting program. They couldn't recycle the paper either. So the global C-suite people said to the maintenance staff, stop putting the plastic in. But nobody told the rest of the staff, this whole global office. And they responded by thinking, these guys are being cheap. They weren't open. They didn't tell the story. They weren't authentic and genuine and vulnerable. And therefore, the people just took this simplest assumption and thought they were being cheap. And who knows? So they could not share the story with the outside world because it didn't work. How many clients were they losing? How much morale was hurt? And there's one other thing too. The global CEO of the company, just across the hall, he felt he could not speak about he felt he could not speak about sustainability because he flew around once, twice a week, all the time. And he felt, if I say anything, it's going to sound like I'm hypocritical. Maybe they'll call me greenwashing, something like that. And so he didn't say anything. He thought by pointing others to do the sustainability that they would lead, but he can't stop leading because everybody sees him. And he thought he was standing by, but he was still leading in the opposite direction than he wanted to. He was leading the whole company to stay silent and hope someone else would do it. And the company was doing that very well. Again, and I should mention, okay, so there I am working with my client, and I walk him through the process I'm going to describe to you in a little bit. And I go through this process of asking him an environmental value. And I don't tell him what to do. I ask him what he cares about. And what comes out is that he loves the ocean. He loves the beach. He grew up on the beach, and he talked about his family and how much he loved being in the water. And it was very touching. It was very meaningful. And then he talked about, recently he was in India, and he happened to be by a beach there. He was there for work, and some water splashed up onto him on this causeway, and it was oily. And he said he couldn't swim in that water. What was in his childhood was unavailable to someone who lived in India. The same thing happened to him when he was in Singapore. And it was very touching and meaningful for him and emotional. And I said, is there something you could do to act on that as part of the structure you'll hear in a little bit? And he looks at the desk where he and I are sitting, and he says, I had this plastic water bottle, this plastic, this oil, it's very closely related. And he says, I'm not going to get any more plastic water bottles. And I walk him through to make it a SMART goal: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound, and attach some accountability. The next time that I come into the office, I meet not with him, but the number two, the person who reports to him. And she says, he stopped getting plastic water bottles, and he talked about the beach stuff. And now this team, we stopped, they were getting water bottles by the crate, and they stopped doing that. Because he shared where it came from. It came from inside. He was being authentic, genuine, and it ended up being effective. So what I do when I work with a corporation, or I work with you, HR people within, is to bring into one or two people the initial practice, and then teach them or teach you how to bring that to others within the organization. You can learn in a very small, simple way what looks like a small thing that doesn't make a big difference in the whole world, but it teaches you or your teams or leaders within your teams how to act, to share their vulnerability, but then act on it, and how to spread that within an organization, and it can make big differences. And these things come out when you work on things, even if where you start is personal, because as we know, leadership is very personal. And at the top level, what people do as leaders, as executives, people see that, and people follow what people above them do. You can develop the skills anywhere, but once you know how to apply them, you can apply them. If you don't practice them, you can read all you want. You can watch all the TED Talks that you want, but if you don't really practice them yourself, you don't know how to exert these things. You don't know how to do these things. Okay, story number 3. If you look at my podcast, you'll see one of my guests was Vincent Stanley. He's been with Patagonia, the clothing company, the outdoor equipment company, since 1973. He's a director there. He also teaches at the Yale School of Management. And he and I have become friends since he's been a guest on my show. And about a year and a half ago, I happened to go out to California. And he said, if you're going to be in California, go to Ventura, California, because that's where Patagonia's global headquarters are. And I'll arrange for you to get a private tour and get to see the global headquarters. I thought, that sounds great. I'd love to see it. So I go there. And it's a very informal tour. There's a guy who meets me at the front, and he says, okay, I'll show you around. So we're going around the place, and we stop in this department, that department. So there's design and there's accounting and things like that. And I'm talking to different people. I'm very impressed with how everybody gets the ethos of the company, because if you read about Yvon Chouinard, the founder, and everything about the company, is sustainability is a major piece of it. But that's not my main point. It happens to be about lunchtime. I was in the material science part where they test materials. It just happened to be here. It was an informal meeting, so an informal tour. So it just happened to be that the woman who was there, when it was lunchtime, I said, would you mind joining me for lunch? And she said, sure. So we go to lunch, and we're sitting there at the cafeteria. And I look over and I see that, I forget exactly what it was. It was either silverware or the cups, something that in many places is they use disposable things. So say it was cups. And they had reusable cups. And not only reusable, but they weren't even plastic. So they were like glass or mugs. And I say, in other places, they tend to use disposable there. How come you guys don't? And I should mention, I was at Coca-Cola's global headquarters in Atlanta. And when I met with their sustainability team, this is before this, and we went down to the cafeteria there, I said, wow, there's so much waste here. There's so many things that are disposable that don't have to be. And the sustainability team said, really? Like what? And I was like, the cups, the silverware, and they hadn't even noticed. So Patagonia is the opposite way. So I said, how does it happen to be that you use non-disposable? And she said, there's a whole story. And I don't remember the names, but she said one person noticed that we were using disposable a long time ago and said, we should do something about that, but didn't know what to do. Another person heard we should do something about it and thought of a plan, but didn't know how to implement it. And a third person entirely said, oh, there's a plan to implement. I know how to implement it. And that's how they switched over. It was 3 different people, each of them not knowing what would come next. Now, I don't know what it's like where you are, but I can tell you New York City in the summertime, virtually every place, if it's 100 degrees outside, sorry if there's people from Europe, I don't know the Celsius, or outside the US. If it's 100 degrees outside, it's often 60 degrees inside. People are wearing sweaters. They got space heaters on under the desks. And many people have had this happen with them. They go to the building manager or the sustainability team or someone, and they say, it's really cold in here. We're wasting energy. It's uncomfortable. We can't get work done. And then the building manager or the sustainability team, someone will say, on the 8th floor, there's this one office, and if we don't cool the whole building down to 60 degrees, then that one office is like 90 degrees. And in order to fit that one office, we got to lower the whole building temperature. And so they say, what you can do, just wear a sweater or put on a space heater. And that's what people do. People learn to give up. I mean, there might be some savings in not lowering the temperature so much in cost savings and sustainability. That's very important. I don't want to take away from that. But more importantly, what does that do for a team when everybody feels like what I say just does, nothing happens? I come up with something, other people say why it can't be done, not why it can be done. I tend to buy my clothes from thrift shops in New York City. And in all my time shopping at thrift shops, I've seen one Patagonia bag, and I've never seen Patagonia clothing in thrift stores. Partly because Patagonia has this policy that they'll fix their clothes, but also because their clothes are incredibly high quality. All of their equipment is very well known to be very high quality. They charge a premium for it, and people are very happy to pay that premium because they know what's going on within that company. And quality does not come out of the ground. It's not something that you pay for. It comes from people who care about what they do. And Patagonia, their teams know what to do. I just saw one thing that happened in the cafeteria, but everything they do, everyone is aligned. And those teams, they love what they do and they deliver. Thrift shops are filled with H&M and Zara and all this disposable clothing, but never Patagonia. If you want to hire top people today, if you're going to hire people who are coming into the workforce now, who are looking at 30, 40, 50 years of their lives we know what's happening right now with COVID. The scientific community that predicted what would happen today predicted a lot more to come. This is not the last of it. In fact, it's going to increase and increase and increase. If you're Patagonia and you want to hire, and a position opens up, there's a line of hundreds of people that want that position. And when I talk to people there, they loved working there. And they're happy to bring other people in. If you're at a major fossil fuel company, you have to pay top dollar. You're not able to get people at that company. And that's a lot of work. How much are you paying to get more people? How much are you paying to train them? When at Patagonia, it happens automatically. So now I want to describe what I do. I'm going to tell you what I do and how you can do it yourself in your companies. If you want to do it yourself, please do. My goal is to make the world a better place, to make it cleaner, to build morale, to lower costs, things like that. And if you watch my first TEDx talk, my TEDx NYU talk, I go through it in a lot more depth, but there's a 4-step process and you can do this yourself. Step 1 is, first I meet the person and talk a little bit. And if you listen to my podcast, by the way, you can also hear me doing this with Vincent Stanley and global leaders like the 3-time global managing director of McKinsey, people like that. Step 1, I ask them, what does the environment mean to you? Because I don't start with, here's one little thing you can do for the environment, or here's something you could do, or I don't tell them what to do. Management is important, but this is leadership. Leadership begins with emotions, images, stories. These are the things that start us off. This is the domain of leadership. So I ask them, what does the environment mean to you? If you ever act on the environment, what do you think of when you act on it? And almost always the first answer is a platitude. Oh, my children, or future generations, or it's the air that we breathe. Well, they cared about the environment before their kids came around. An example is, one of the examples, the one I like to tell the most is Brian Brayman, who's a Philadelphia Eagle, and he won the Super Bowl. This is just after he won the Super Bowl. And I asked him, what does the environment mean to you? And he went back and forth a little bit. And he described how when he was a child, his grandfather took him fishing in the Pacific Northwest, and they'd hike. And that really meant something to him. And apparently now the streams that were filled with salmon now have more plastic in them than they used to, and fewer salmon. But that's something that really meant something to him. And everyone that I talk to, there's something very personal that's very meaningful for them that comes out. And then I asked him, then the next step is step 2. Is there something you could do to act on that feeling, that emotion, that story. And again, there generally tends to be a platitude that comes out. They'll say, oh, I'll go without straws for a week or something like that. And I say, well, does that have to do with what you talked about? And then we go back and forth until they come up with something that's to act on their value, something that is personal for them. And so for another example, a recent guest that I had was Larry Yatch, a US Navy SEAL, now retired. And he talked about how, well, what he did was I'll tell a story. As a warrior, as a Navy SEAL, when he's in battle, if a teammate is down, he has to do what it takes to go and save that person. So he has to motivate himself to do the most incredible things. And what he did, he chose for himself, the activity he did to choose for himself was to, with his wife and 2 sons, to pick up garbage from the beach. It sounds very personal. Sounds like not very big, but the result was, he said, Josh, I had to shove away many emotions, but when I was working with my wife and my kids, some emotions came out that I never really thought of before. He said, if emotions were crayons, my wife has like a box of 128 and I got 3. But doing this, I started unearthing emotions that I really hadn't done before. And I started to tell the difference between different emotions, and it started really becoming meaningful for him. And that's what happens. And that's why I want to illustrate people, when they come up with something that they really care about for their reasons, not because I told them what to do, but something that they came up with. These things happen. And it's often with wife, kids, family, but often with the CEO, with the top people in the company. So step 1 was, what does the environment mean to you? Step 2 is, what's something you can do to act on it? Step 3 and 4 are more managerial. So step 3 is, make it a SMART goal. So a lot of times people will say something that's kind of vague, like I'll eat less meat or something like that. Well, making it a SMART goal, and for people who don't know, SMART is specific, measurable, realistic, or achievable, realistic, and time-bound, SMART. And it helps them. So if they just say, I'm going to eat less meat, well, make it more specific. How much less? For how long? And then the final step is, can you tell me sometime when you'll be able to tell me how it went, and can we schedule a phone call? And so this is adding accountability, where you tell me how it went. And by this time, people, because they came up with something themselves, they almost always say, this is something I've really wanted to do for a while. I'm really glad to do this. I often ask them, is this something you're doing for me? And they'll say, no, this is something I've really wanted to do. And they're not doing it for me. So now people might pick something like, they won't use disposable cups for a week, or Lorna Davis, who's she just retired from the C-suite of Danone, a $30 billion company, I think. And she went for a year buying no new clothes. And people pick things like that. So at the end of that period, I speak to them and I ask 3 questions. So now, if you work with the CEO in your company or the chief sustainability officer in your company, you come back to them later after that period. So say they decide to go without plastic bottles for a month. At the end of the month, you schedule a meeting with them, and you meet in person or by call. And I ask these questions. The first one is, how did it go? What happened? And then they usually give me a factual account of what happened. And usually they really enjoy it. And they tend to say things like, wow, I'm really glad I did this. I wish I'd done this earlier. And I listen and I reinforce and I hear what happened. And then the second question is, okay, that was the play-by-play. That's very interesting. What was the emotion like? What was the emotional journey that you went through? Almost always they wake up here. Well, they've already been awake, but they brighten up. And they say things like, this was really fun. This was joyful. This was easier than I expected. If I'd known it was this easy or this rewarding, I would have done it a long time before. And then I go back and forth a bit to really solidify those emotions, because those are the emotions that they're going to share with others when they do it with others. And then the last one is, can you tell me about the relationships? So what happened? Were other people hurdles? Were other people problems? And almost always the result is that they thought other people were going to be a problem. Like, oh, my wife will never go for this, or the CTO or the CFO, they'll never get this. But once they commit and start doing it, they do what leaders do, which is they start seeing other people as part of the solution, not part of the problem. And it switches, and they start engaging other people. And they almost always tell stories about people got closer to them and how they got more teamwork. Now, this is how I work with one person at a time. And I hope that I've given enough, or with the video, that you can do this yourselves. You can listen to my podcast. You can watch the first TEDx talk. And I hope that you can do this yourself. I can also come in and do it, and I've had a lot of experience with it. The next step is to teach them how to do it so that they can do it with their teams. The next step after that is to be able to implement this, not just on a one-person basis or small team basis, but to get it to spread throughout a whole company. And what happens is, of course, you get the things that you expect. The company has a sustainability policy, so you're able to answer the question when customers or potential customers are looking for it. You're able to address competitive threats. But what you really see more than anything else is this boost in morale, that the people you work with directly, they thank you for this. And the bigger the project that they do, the more work that they do, amazingly, the more that they thank you. Morale increases, turnover decreases, and you start being able to, people want to bring in people, especially if you want younger people who are the most talented people. And you'll hear on my podcast, for example, several people on the podcast are people who became leaders specifically for doing what other people knew should be done, but didn't do. Many people look at sustainability and say, we have huge issues right now. We got to lower costs. We got to do this. We got to do that. We'll get to that later. Well, if you are the one, or you lead people to become, if you develop the people who are the leaders in the area of the environment, you'll hear on my podcast, people who rose to leadership positions in places like Apple, Google, GE, McDonald's, and the federal government. In fact, the opportunity for leadership in this area, it's kind of funny to talk about this as a silver lining, but the opportunity for leaders, this is an unbelievable opportunity because virtually no one is doing it. Virtually everybody looks at actually learning the personal skills. They say one person using fewer bottles doesn't make a difference, but they don't realize leadership development is about developing skills. And when you have the skills, you can act on them. I have a few minutes. I'm not sure if any questions have come up. I don't see any. So I'm happy to take some if they come up, but I'll give a little bit about it, my personal background that made this happen. So if you go way back, I've always cared about the environment. I would turn off the lights when I wasn't in the room. About 5 years ago, I decided to, I looked down at my garbage in my house and I thought, I've always said governments should change, corporations should change, all sorts of other people should do things. But for the first time I looked down and I thought, this is a lot of garbage. Maybe government should change, maybe corporations should change, maybe it's out of my hands. But I can take responsibility for this stuff right here, right now. And I gave myself a challenge. Could I go for 1 week without buying any packaged food? At the time I thought, it just popped in my head. And I thought, can I really do this? I don't know if I've ever had a meal in my entire life that wasn't filled with, that didn't have at least some packaged food in it. So not knowing how to do it, I gave myself the challenge and I decided to go for it. Actually, there were 6 months when I thought about it and kept doing what school taught me, what I was very good at, which was to analyze the situation and to plan and to plan and to plan, but never actually do it. And one day I just said, look, I'm going to start right now. This planning is actually delaying me starting. And so I started, and I made it 2.5 weeks. And in that 2.5 weeks, I found the opposite of what I expected. Instead of it becoming hard, it became actually intriguing. And I started learning how to cook from scratch. And well, I'm not going to go all the details. There was actually a brief period when my food was not particularly delicious, but then suddenly it started becoming more delicious, more convenient, cheaper when I thought it would be less convenient and more expensive. People started coming over more, so it became more social. And I began to see acting on my environmental values as bringing joy and community and connection. That's not what I expected. But then a bit later, I learned kind of by accident. I was watching some guy speak and it said that flying New York, LA round trip warmed the globe about a year's worth of driving. Living in Manhattan without a car, I thought my pollution was a lot less, but all my flying was really adding up, was putting way over the Paris Agreement recommendations. I thought, I wonder if I could go for a little bit without flying. Now, a week without flying, that doesn't really mean much. And so I thought, could I go for a year without flying? And at first I thought, that's impossible. Probably all of you, if any of you are thinking, could I go for a year without flying? Actually, it's all changed now because of COVID, in a kind of odd situation that a lot of people are not flying now who thought they couldn't. So I gave myself the challenge. And after a few months of not flying, I found that almost everything that was missing from flying, that I thought could only come from flying, I was able to create otherwise. So I was able to get more time with family, more control over my environment, over my career. And it just started improving my life in ways. And so now it's now March 25th. I've just started my 5th year of not flying. As you heard with the not getting packaging, it takes me about a year to fill up a load of garbage. Most of all, it's the joy and community and connection. And that's what motivates me. If you see passion in what I'm sharing and what I'm working on, and a lot of people say you can't really make much of a difference, well, watch me. And I hope I can bring to your companies what I've brought to my life and also to the people around me, because people crave leadership in this area at a corporate level, at a society level. So I see a question here.
Yes. Josh, can you see the question? Or do you
Yeah.
want to do that?
So as you talk about leadership skills and making changes, you've mentioned things like discipline, awareness. What specific skills are critical in leadership change or evidenced in your 3 stories? I'm glad you asked, because the skills in leadership, in environmental leadership, are generally the same as in other types of leadership. But people often don't see it, because I think like the global CEO that I talked about, I think he feels if he might have to feel, I think he's worried about shame or guilt. And leaders are used to managing emotions and self-awareness. So these are some of the skills. Your self-awareness, what's your emotional state? What's the emotional state of others? And I think with guilt and shame, they're different than the typical business emotions of ambition or how to manage risk and things like that. So awareness of your emotions, awareness of others' emotions, and also things like, it's similar for major changes in your life. If you want to start, say, an exercise regime, you might read about, say, lifting weights. But it's not just about lifting weights. It's also about, do you go to the gym regularly? So what are your priorities, and how do you act on your priorities? And how do you take the old priorities that you're reprioritizing? How do you get rid of them? How do you say no to things that aren't important? How do you handle when someone says to you, oh, it won't make a difference? So how do you handle adversity? How do you handle people not being helpful or people misunderstanding? It's much more social and emotional skills. Everybody knows how to not fly. It's very easy not to get in an airplane. We're all not getting in airplanes right now. The challenge is, how do you replace that to make your life and your career better than it would have been otherwise? So that's a skill of having faith in yourself to fill in what was going away. Now, hopefully you recognize these as, if you do any major behavioral, habitual change in your life, you have to go through these things. In the area of the environment, it's very similar, but most people search for scientific evidence. They search for information about carbon dioxide or methane or mercury. Those are important, but I find that your level of scientific understanding really only has to be at the level of, say, I don't know how tobacco influences lung cancer. I'm sure there's some great science behind it, but if my niece or nephew comes to me and says, should I start smoking? I know enough of the science to say, no, you shouldn't start smoking. Or I don't know much about how alcohol affects reaction time, but I know if someone says, should I drink and drive? I know enough of the science to say, no, you shouldn't drink and drive. And so the science is not really, you don't really need to learn that much. It's really much more about, how do you handle adversity? How do you handle, what's your emotional state? How do you say no to the old priorities? How to say yes to the new priorities? How do you find mentors? So it's those things, but there is some nuance when you apply it in areas where people feel guilt, where people feel shame. So the clients of mine that work the best are the successful leaders who have gone through personal change or have gone through corporate change, because they recognize, oh, this is what I've been doing all before. But they don't get distracted. I help them not be distracted by things that aren't so distracting. So I help alleviate that confusion, those feelings of, many leaders know if they don't know all the answers, well, leadership projects are the ones where you don't know all the answers. So when people feel like they generally know in other areas, if they say, look, I don't know the answers, none of us knows all the answers, but let's sit down and figure this out together and we'll do the best that we can. That's a sign of strength. They know that creates loyalty, that engages people. In the area of the environment, for some reason, people don't like to say, I don't know all the answers. And so you have cases where you have inadvertent leadership in the opposite direction because people follow what people actually do. And if you hide it, if you feel twisted up inside, I can't share this, I don't know what to say, you're going to have a company that's twisted up inside. Patagonia is not like that. They're not twisted up inside. They're firing on all cylinders, and they're happy to. So I hope that answered the question.
Josh, do you want to ask any questions of the audience?
The big thing is, do people feel like they want to act, or they want to engage teams in their firms to act? If there's anything I can do to help them actually start implementing what I talked about. Of course, the first TEDx talk gives you more depth. Listening to the podcast gives you yet more depth. But do people feel, is there anything holding them back from starting right now? Because I can tell you that no one will know the answers, and it takes practice to do it. Glad to see that the nuance of guilt and shame. Yes, it really hamstrings people. I'm going to comment on that. That when there are many emotions that people feel, and if I go over there, it'll make me happy. I'll go over there and make me happy. If I read that piece of news, it'll make me feel outraged. A lot of times people go there. Many emotions, people know that they either want to go to it or away from it. Guilt, shame, anxiety, confusion, especially at the workplace. These are emotions that we tend to avoid, but barely at the level of consciousness. So we lower our self-awareness. It doesn't take much to get past that. In fact, generally, guilt and shame get transformed into enthusiasm if you act on them. The thing is that most of us, and I count myself as this all the time, but especially before I started acting, I would just avoid going in that direction. If someone started talking to me about environmental things, I think, I don't want to talk to that person. But once you start acting, the people that I work with, what they share is joy. What they share is enthusiasm and community and connection. So you can kind of sense that there's guilt and shame, but we hide away from it. But then when we act on it with enthusiasm, it becomes joy, it becomes enthusiasm. So COVID-19 seems to be derailing many organizations. Does this timing present an opportunity to champion these types of projects? Yeah, okay, first, the language I like to use here is Stephen Covey's from 7 Habits, Quadrant 1, Quadrant 2. So Quadrant 1 is important, urgent. And right now, COVID is important and urgent. Lives are at stake. People are figuring out how to work from home and things like that. And by all means, listen to the experts with the important, urgent things. I don't know if you saw my mom pop in. I'm what's the word? Social distancing by being outside Manhattan, and follow the advice of experts for important, urgent things. But companies and people who want to develop and become the tops in their fields, that want to lead, they get there through Quadrant 2, which is non-urgent, important. And as I said before, the scientists, the community that predicted that there are going to be pandemics, I mean, these predictions go back generations. We know the specifics of this one are specific, but that a pandemic would hit, and that it would be more likely to hit with overpopulation and with over-traveling. We knew that this was coming. Very few prepared for it. Actually, the places that are most prepared for it are the places that had SARS before, and they know what's happening. They know how to prepare. They know how to react quickly. But that community predicted more. The next thing might be flooding. It might be weather related. It might be global warming related. It might be a blight that wipes out one of our monocrops. We know that more is coming. Do we want to be prepared for these or not? By all means, focus as much as necessary on the important, urgent things. But those who focus on the non-urgent, important things, like developing their people to develop the skills of environmental leadership, these are the ones that when the next thing comes will be well prepared. So you see that happening with some governments that were very well prepared from their experience. And you see it not happening in places that weren't well prepared, that didn't have the experience. If you get the experience on a small scale, as we heard from my client at the fossil fuel place, he got the skills on small things, but was able to apply them in big things. So COVID-19, it's a tragedy. I don't want to make light of that, but there's also an opportunity for corporations and for individuals to rise and to lead if we use this on the on the important non-urgent things. I hope that answered that question.
Thank you, Josh.
So I'm over. I'm actually happy to keep going because I mean, this is a big passion of mine, and I'm starting to see places that didn't listen to things like this before, that are thinking, oh my God, this is really important. This is not something to put off, even if the thing hasn't hit us just yet.
We do have our next speaker starting in about 5 minutes. So if you want to go for a couple more minutes, that's fine. Did you want to go for a couple more minutes?
Well, if any questions come up, I'm
Yeah.
still, I mean, the big thing that for me that holds people back is simply starting. So if anything, if anyone is out there thinking, yeah, I'll get to this later, maybe next month, or maybe after this crisis ends, if I can help them reach, I want to start this now, that's something I'd like to help with. Or um, if anything's holding people back, that's what I want to work on most. Because like any skills, you can read, you can listen, you can analyze, but the real learning comes from practice, from doing. And I can guarantee this, the first time you do it, you're going to hit some hurdles. The second time you do it, it'll work a little better. By the third time, you're going to enjoy it. I mean, one of the values that I bring in is I've been doing this for decades. So I've been coaching leadership, teaching leadership, and then practicing environmental leadership for a long, long time. I've seen a lot of the problems that have come up. There's only so much I can fit into a 30, now 40-minute talk, but you will learn from experience. And no matter how challenging it feels at the beginning, the more that you do it, the more you'll wish you had started earlier. And no matter how big something feels that you start now, after you do it, you'll look back and say, that was small in comparison. And no matter how much you think, I'm doing this, but no one else is doing it, I feel kind of weird. If I'm the one who's bringing in my forks and spoons, metal instead of plastic, or implementing with my teams some project that I'm not sure if it's vetted yet, a year from now, you'll look back and everyone will look back and say, that was easier than we thought. It was smaller than we thought. And everyone around you will do it. And you'll think, oh, this is normal. This is what everyone's doing. I mean, Patagonia, everyone does it. It's just normal there that if someone sees something that's wasteful, they say, look at this waste. Let's do something about it. Opposite of my experience here in virtually every other company is when someone says that's a problem, they're like, yeah, I know, but we got to live with it. Yeah, I know, but we got to live with it, or someone else will take care of it. Does that lead to high quality merchandise? Does that lead to a premium? Does that lead to competitive advantages? Does that lead to people want to work there? I don't think so. This is really about joy and connection and community. The environment does that. And the positions are available, even if people don't realize it yet. I mean, CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer, a lot of places don't have that position and could. And if they did, they'd get more, they'd know how to respond to clients, they'd know how to address competitive and new entrants into the field.